welcome to F4G Advocacy Media. I'm Mark.
I'm Crystal.
And you're watching the Journey series of video podcasts. Today, we're joined by Catherine Yoder, who who runs adult advocacy centers in Ohio, and she's here to tell us more about that and more about her journey. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Crystal.
How's it going?
It's going. How are you both doing?
Good. Catherine, can you explain what your journey and what got you started in adult advocacy services?
Sure. So my background includes investigations. My career spans many, many years of doing investigations around children and adults with disabilities, from children's services to community living to, investigations of even facilities and individuals throughout the state. And the one thing that ended up being a pattern was that you would go in, you would kind of identify where the gaps were or what abuse was occurring. And there would be certain stopgap measures that would be put in place. Eventually it would all start to repeat itself. And so the mechanisms that kind of weren't in place to kind of, curb abuse really did not seem as effective from my standpoint. And I noticed a lot of gaps that ended up showcasing that people with disabilities really were not necessarily involved in the investigations. They were not active participants. And a lot of times they ended up being excluded. So I created this nonprofit. I got an amazing team who joined with me, and that is the reason why we have gotten so much success. Our Deputy Director, Leah Schaup, her background is in child advocacy centers. She was a executive director. Wow. Communications director, Stacy Bronan-Smith. Her background was working with the PNAs. So when it comes to accessibility and accommodations, she's amazing. Our grants coordinator, Jackie Martin, her background has been with nonprofits. She's also a very proud and fierce advocate within the disability community. She has a very, very long history advocating for the rights of people with disabilities. And then we work with some amazing consultants that really have helped elevate our work. What we ended up doing initially was just a needs assessment because there really wasn't a lot of baseline data that existed for the issue of victimization against people with disabilities. We knew that the statistics were people with disabilities are about 4 times more likely to be victimized than people without disabilities. And that is really an appalling statistic. And it's also one that really, it hasn't changed since they first started collecting statistics in like the 80s. And we all know that, abuse is underreported anyways. And then you factor in, how, and I'm saying this sarcastically, how accessible systems are for reporting for people with disabilities. So we know that number.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's significantly higher. But even if it, was at 4 times more, that's appalling. That's an epidemic. And so we really wanted some baseline data to just be able to showcase, yes, everyone knows that this is a problem, but let's kind of pare that down. Let's kind of dig into what that looks like. And so essentially what we found out is something that's really reflective of the national trend. It's not really state specific, and there really aren't a lot of programs for people with disabilities who have been victimized by crime. There's not enough trauma counseling. A huge area is that the majority of the time, people with disabilities once they've been victimized, a lot of times aren't even interviewed or seen as a credible witness. And if you are labeled as nonverbal, good luck trying to get anyone to talk to you. Or if you use any kind of communication device or alternative or augmented technology. So, there's huge gaps. And as a result of that, prosecution rates for people who have been victimized, going after that perpetrator, it's in the single digits, which is just, all that does is just reinforce to people, hey, this is definitely a population that you're not going to necessarily be held accountable for if you target. And that's just unacceptable. So what we ended up doing is kind of basing our work in Ohio, piloting it here, but we really work on a national level. And one of the first things that we focused on was that interview piece, because, justice and paths to justice, if you have a disability, that looks very different. And as someone who's part of the community myself, it was very, very apparent that, the big piece was you have all these people talking for people with disabilities with the interviews, structuring them in a way where the person with the disability really didn't have a voice. And the issue was never the fact of giving the disabled community a voice. We've had a voice. We have a very strong voice. The issue is teaching everybody else how to listen. And so what we did is we looked at some interview techniques that were already in place, so that we weren't necessarily reinventing the wheel. And there's this type of interview technique called forensic interviewing. That's kind of synonymous or is always done with child advocacy centers. And child advocacy centers are really a place where people who are trained as forensic interviewers or forensic nurse examiners, children who are abused and need to be interviewed, go to these facilities to be interviewed. There's a multidisciplinary team that consists of like law enforcement, prosecutor, victim advocate, and the forensic interviewer and the child are in this room and it's recorded. But the thing about forensic interviewing is that it's not a developmental technique. It's not something that only works for kids. It's a narrative technique, which means it can be adapted for other populations. And who's better at adapting things for other populations than us, because our entire lives are trying to make, the society and the systems that we work in more adaptable and more accessible for our needs. And so that's what we did. We adapted forensic interviewing for adults, and we specialize in adults with disabilities. And currently, I think we have about 5 protocols where we have one for interviewing people who don't speak traditionally through speech. And a lot of times those people are going to be labeled as nonverbal. And we got a little bit of pushback initially as far as, that's not really a population where you guys should be spending a lot of time focusing on. And, our response to that was, those are our people. That's still part of our population. And it's been my experience that about 98% of the population is able to communicate in some way. The difference is sometimes we can't receive that communication. And that doesn't mean that they're not communicating. It's just we don't have the skills or the knowledge yet to recognize it as communication. And a lot of times you hear people say, well, they can't be interviewed. And really, in another context, that's victim blaming. And no, the issue isn't that they can't be interviewed. The issue is that we just don't know how to interview them yet. So, for that piece, a lot of times people focus a lot on terminology like nonverbal or functioning level. And those terms really tell you absolutely nothing about the person. All it does is just perpetuate some really negative stereotypes.
Yes.
So what we ended up doing, for example, for the case or for the protocol for interviewing people who don't speak traditionally through speech, just an example of a case where we were able to kind of work on someone who would have fit within that protocol. We got a call from a sheriff, and it was a sexual assault case. And they said, look, we have this victim who is nonverbal. We can't interview her, but we already know who the perpetrator is. So we're going to move forward. But if you guys want to interview her, go ahead and do it. So we did. And our interviews can take longer. That interview took about 3 days, or I'm sorry, 3 hours, but we can do multi-session interviews. There are some people you really need to spend a lot of time developing rapport with. And there's a lot of trust issues within the disability community when it comes to things like reporting crime and being treated with dignity and respect and value, and they're valid trust issues. So we went down and we did that interview, and this, and law enforcement, like I said, was already focused on a specific suspect. But at the end of that interview, the survivor was able to tell us a lot of information about what had happened, which was wonderful. But the really cool thing was this survivor, who had been labeled as nonverbal, was able to communicate who the correct perpetrator was. The person that law enforcement was looking at was not the right perpetrator. The correct perpetrator was a staff person who filed the incident report. And law enforcement was able to corroborate that, and it's headed towards a grand jury. But that's just an example of cases where, this person would have never been interviewed. The correct perpetrator wouldn't have been identified. And, I think the big thing is really understanding that people are very powerful. They have a lot more to offer than sometimes what you can see. And you don't really understand that until you sit down and you get to know them.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
yeah. So, and right now we're working specifically on a protocol for interviewing older adults with disabilities with an emphasis on Alzheimer's and dementia. And again, there isn't this, idea that we're going to have 100% success rate and always get a disclosure. That's not what the point of forensic interviewing is. It really is giving that person that platform and that structure to be able to tell their experience in their own words. And there are some cases where we just don't, like I said, have the skills or knowledge yet to be able to understand that is communication. But if nothing else, we can sit there with that person and, talk to them and, just even spending time with someone, especially people who have spent their lives in facilities. A lot of times that really means quite a lot, because unfortunately there's this concept that if something happens to you on first shift, you better be over it by third shift, because no one wants to hear about it anymore. And so just basic empathy and compassion. A lot of times, people will look at someone and really have these very stereotypical ideas in their head, and just, basic humanity doesn't even click in. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing. We are addressing a lot of the issues surrounding accessibility and accommodations within the criminal justice system. We are also working with forensic nurses. So forensic nurse examiners, a lot of times people associate those with more of a sexual assault case, or, you'll hear a lot about rape kits, and that's something that forensic nurses conduct, but they also just do a plethora of other things outside of sexual assault. They do all different types of cases. Their job is to collect physical evidence. And so we have been working with them to really add to their training. We're working with an organization to come up with a national protocol for forensic nurses on interaction with people with disabilities, because communication can be a huge barrier. And, even again, with language, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about sane nurses. Sane nurses are the ones that do the rape kits, which sane nurses are forensic nurses. And even that language, is something we're trying to get the field to move away from, because if you say to someone who's a concrete thinker or somebody who has mental health, hey, here comes a sane nurse, there's an excellent chance they're going to go chickadee boom, because they think it has to do with their competency, and it's a trigger and it's unnecessary. And so those are things, just really basic things that within the disability community, those terms, if I say to either one of you, if someone says sane nurse, what context would you think of? Well, at some point you're going to come up with the mental health and the concrete thinker, and someone might think that has to do with competency. Outside of the disability community, people don't think about that initially. And so that's why a lot of times when people are talking about different fields like criminal justice and victim services, there's a big push towards inclusion. And I think, I think that's something we need to push away from. I think inclusion is great in theory, but it's kind of like the wrapping on the gift. We don't really want to just be told we can show up. We want there to be a place for us. We want to be able to have an equal voice. We want to be full participants. It's not just enough to include us, it's give us space too, to be able to stand on our own. And so, the part that's really cool about our organization is that, this is a whole new field, forensic interviewing for adults with disabilities. It's never been something that's been created before. We have these series of protocols, again, something that's never been created before. And it's something that was created by the disability community for the disability community. And I think a lot of times people forget we're a culture. And as a result, you can't have other people come into your culture to solve all the issues. Historically, that has not been overly effective. And so it's one of those things where, we are more than capable of coming up with innovation, of coming up with new ideas, of piloting things, of trying things out. But a lot of times, we feel like we need permission or we need agency from someone before people really feel like they can step out, like they need that validation. And the issue is that being part of this community, I mean, we're part of a community that people have tried to stifle, have tried to institutionalize, have tried to kill, genocide for, that's our history. And so we don't really need permission or agency to have our space. We've earned that space, and a lot of people have sacrificed quite a lot to make sure that we can occupy that space. And so, that's something that kind of propelled us to start this National Disability Collaborative Justice Coalition. So we now have this national coalition of disability-led organizations that do criminal justice and victim service work to kind of stand in solidarity on certain topics, because unfortunately, a lot of times we end up so siloed here in the disability community. People kind of want us to stay in our place. And that was a big problem for our agency because we don't really have a place, and I've never been good at staying in my place. So we do all disabilities under the ADA. We do all victimizations, and the funding systems that exist are not in place to allow cross-cultural disability silo work. I was told, hey, pick a disability. You can get it funded if you pick a disability. Well, again, historically, it doesn't ever seem to work out well if you pick one group over another and then you try to go back to them. And if it works for everyone, you offer it to everyone. So that's what we're doing. So we've had some issues with some funding and those kind of things. We do receive VOCA funding. Ironically, we have really support from everyone that we've worked with, state governments, local governments, agencies. But what we are in the process of doing, and March has been already a little busy, is we are establishing this position paper that we're going to be releasing in the next few weeks that states forensic interviews done by a forensic interviewer who specializes in disability now qualifies as an ADA accommodation under Title II. For the reasonable and effective, people always forget that word. It has to be effective communication.
Right.
It's not enough to call for an ASL interpreter if the person you're getting the ASL interpreter for doesn't speak American Sign Language. If they speak like Mexican Sign Language, having that ASL interpreter there is useless, but people forget the effective communication is a requirement. And so we're also including forensic nurses in that position paper. So there'll also be a requirement for forensic nurses. who specialize in disability to be an ADA accommodation. And that's going to have a pretty big impact nationally, because now it's legal. Yeah, well, and it's legally tied to something. And the issue is and I know you both are aware of this because we've spoken about it, that, you know, unfortunately, you just want people to do the right thing. And you feel like, you know, because it's the right thing, people are going to do it. And, you know, and we all know better, but, you know, you still occasionally hold on to that hope. And, you know, when it comes to our community, our progress, our steps have all had to occur in the courts. I mean, if it wasn't for Olmstead, you know, we would still be in the institutions. You know, if it wasn't for, you know, all of the special education lawsuits, you know, there would still be, you know, no access to schools. So unfortunately, you know, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we're very, very good at understanding how to navigate at least the laws as far as what we're entitled to and what we're not. And this is definitely an area that people are currently being forensic interviewed, particularly more so on children, because it's never existed really for adults, by people who aren't trained. And you have a lot of people that are trained as forensic interviews, and that's amazing. And they're probably excellent at what they do. But just because you can interview children does not mean you can interview children with disabilities or adults with disabilities. And, you know, the fact that I'm still having conversations with executive directors as far as there's a difference between adults and children with disabilities. Adults are not just children, you know, because of their disabilities, you know, and these are things where you feel like, hey, it's 2023. Why are we still having these conversations? But we are, we are, and we're having them with people who probably would consider themselves allies to us. You know, it's not necessarily having these conversations with people that, you know, are against the community. These are people that are very, very supportive, but we also sometimes forget that stereotypes are really ingrained. And just because someone achieves a certain level in their profession or status, that doesn't mean that they're bestowed upon with all of this knowledge about all of these other topics. And, you know, with disability, it's either something that you're knowledgeable about or you're not. And you know, it is pretty interesting to see the lack of knowledge and how firmly and how rooted these stereotypes truly are.
Right. I so much appreciate what you do. As I've told you, I've listened to and dealt with my own situations, dealing with everything that you're doing. And, you know, you talked about like people in the past and making some of this stuff happen, but it not really being fully in place or not being fully understood, or, you know, kind of passive aggressively, maybe it's somewhere in there. But, you know, I really, you know, rest in peace, you know, Judith Heumann, she did a lot of things that we are extremely appreciative of that we have in place. But it's one of those things where she fought so hard to get them in place. But what we're seeing now as a result of those things, people have been able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think bringing up Judith Heumann is an excellent example, because she really was a very fierce advocate. I think the what's interesting to me is if you're born with a disability, you're kind of born with the birthright of advocacy, because it's something that, you know, whether you choose to accept that advocacy and go after it or you don't, it's something that it gets placed on your shoulders, because you really do have to fight And the issue is, are you going to just fight for yourself, or are you going to fight for others too? And Judith is an excellent example of that. But, I think the other thing that we really do not as a community do an excellent job of is really exploring our disability history. I think that's an area where, there is a lot more work that needs to be done. I know that Lois Curtis died a few months ago, and she was she was the lead plaintiff for the Olmstead lawsuit that literally allowed, and put into place the whole community integration for people leaving those institutions and coming out into the community. And, it's one of those situations where, it would have been nice to, preserve some of her thoughts and, some of her experiences, because she had that firsthand knowledge. And so we have a lot of heroes and a lot of legends and a lot of really amazing activists that are still with us. And as a community, we just don't do the best job of really honoring people while they're here. There are certain people who everyone knows, their name, Alice Wong, Judith Heumann, but, people lesser known, perhaps, like Anita Cameron, who, has been arrested over 100 times. And, she has been an activist for Indigenous rights, Black rights, women's rights. She's just pretty much been in every march that there's been, Capitol Crawl. Leroy Moore, Patty Bryan, that there are so many of our heroes, I guess, or sheroes that are still with us, that people really are not as well informed about, and whose, lives and actions really have created rights for all of us. And we really are indebted to their work. But unfortunately, a lot of people find out about them after they've already passed on. And that is very, very disappointing. But, it also goes into the fact that disability history, just like, history in general here in the United States, is told through one lens. It is not told through a disability lens. It is also not really told through all of the intersections that our community possesses. Very few people know that there was a federal psychiatric hospital for American Indians. There was only one, and that was in South Dakota. It was Hiawatha, Home of the Insane, or something along those lines. And it housed American Indians that most of them never had any kind of diagnosis or anything. It was just, a place to kind of break people down, especially coming from a community that didn't even have a word for disability. And, as a result, once that era was over, there are all these unmarked graves. They're not really sure how many people are buried on the property, but it's now, the graveyard is sectioned off around a golf course. So people are hitting the balls off these gravestones. And that's our history, especially with the psychiatric hospitals and things like that. There isn't that reverence. There isn't that respect. There isn't that value of our lives. And, that's something I really, really hope this generation and future generations really try to work towards, is kind of preserving our legacy and our history. And unfortunately, our history is not overly happy and peaceful. It's full of abuse and neglect and struggle. And there are definitely some very strong moments of triumph. But it's important for us to be able to kind of see where we came from and be honest about that. And equally honest as far as who was there with us and who were our leaders. And, sometimes history determines to us, these are the people that you really should be prioritizing and putting at this exalted level. But I think there are many, many others that belong up there as well. And we just haven't, given them their roses while they're still here.
Right. It's got to be incredibly linked to those activists and people that have been in the disability community fighting over and over again. It's got to be exciting to them to come to the realization that there's a whole bunch of people in the disability community that are fighting alongside them and stronger now more than ever to do so. And they're not alone in their efforts, you know. Like we talked about Judith, you know, I think about her looking down at us, you know, not just us, but I'm talking about in disability community in general, and seeing all the different things that are going on and all that mirror things that she talked about and wanted to happen and things like that. And she's smiling about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the one piece about Judith's legacy was she was one person. And she was very aware of that. And it seems like one of her really big focuses was mentoring others and really being a light and a support for others. And I think that's something that a lot of times we kind of forget, is how our own actions, how our own lives can intersect with others. And, you know, not everyone, the majority of people are not going to be well-known names like Judith Heumann, but we all have our part. And we all can make a difference, and that can look different for each person. For someone who, you know, has gone through extreme trauma, making a difference could just be getting out of bed. You know, that's huge. And that's enough for that person. You know, and then for somebody else, it may look different. I think, you know, a lot of times within our community, there really needs to be this grace given to people. There's this quote where, you know, someone is going through something, everyone is going through something that you know nothing about. And I think that's very, very important. A lot of times, you know, we kind of determine which struggles we feel like deserves the most compassion and empathy. And, you know, it's not for us to decide. If somebody is struggling with something and that is something that is weighing on them, then, you know, that's all you need to know. You know, and you bring up a good point, Crystal, about, you know, the disability community. You know, a lot of times we get so siloed in our own work that we kind of forget that, you know, a lot of these really big moments of disability history only happened because we came together. And sometimes that's really, really hard, you know, just like any community, there's, you know, people being territorial or people who have, you know, their own agendas, and their own agendas are very, very important to them and valid. But there are certain issues as a community that we have to be able to come together on. I think, you know, and we don't have to, I think the issue is we don't all have to see eye to eye and sing Kumbaya. People can have their own opinions about things, but it's one of those things where, you know, our community is being victimized at a rate of 4 times more than anybody else. Everyone in our community should agree that that's a huge problem. And we should start addressing it in the way that we've addressed other huge problems like employment, transportation, community integration, education. That victimization rate should be right up there with, you know, we should be doing those protests. We should be writing those letters. This is something that we need much more advocacy in this particular area, because this is not a new problem. This has always been a problem. And even before people started documenting it, it's a problem. I mean, you go to any historical psychiatric hospital and you look at the gravestones and you're going to see a named child, you know, and, you know, you have a lot of women who experienced sexual assault and gave birth in these hospitals, and the baby died or the baby was disposed of. And, you know, and then even outside of that, things that the medical community may have been in support of one time, like lobotomies. Now it's considered, you know, torturous. And so, you know, there's also this huge generational and historical trauma that our community carries that no one ever talks about, and no one really discusses that when somebody is being abused and they're threatened by their abuser, that if you say anything, I'm going to commit you to a hospital. There's real fear behind that because it happens. And there is no accountability for it. So, I think that's the piece too, is that, you have had pockets of different rights groups who have been doing work surrounding the high rate of victimization for years within different populations of the disability community. And they may have found some success and the programs may have been very, very good for those pockets, but it's never had that systemic effect. And like I said, this forensic interview piece is really, for the first time, a chance for people to be part of the process, not to be included, but to be part of it, an active participant, and to, and that's the whole point of forensic interviewing, is that, the interview is not about me. The interview is about the person being interviewed. And so it's their story. It's not mine to tell.
Right. I don't want to get too personal here, but like in my situation, like I talk differently, I move differently, it makes people uncomfortable. So would you want to include somebody like that in a testimony or in a court situation? Because it seemingly distorts the perception of what's going on, and that's really sad, because like the way I talk, the way I move has no I can't see, that's the problem right there. Like I try to have a cordial conversation with somebody, and it's not that I don't have the words, I just can't find them sometimes. It's called aphasia.
You were looking for bearing, has no bearing.
Thank you. Yeah. So that's part of why we're so good. We can help each other. But yeah. So like, I have no problem speaking with you and letting you know what's my needs are and what happened in a sequence to whatever, but because I talk funny or don't do things the same, then you automatically think that has something to do with cognitive.
Yeah.
And sorry if I may add one more thing. Also, in addition to that, is that like media in general and just the way our society is, they're more prone to promote the stories and build up those people who they see as worthy of their praise, right? Mm-hmm. And those are the stories that generally get promoted and thrown around, and the people who are actually doing work on the front lines are kind of forgotten about, or nobody bothers to look deeper.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, that actually is the premise to some degree of what the real definition of disability justice is. So it was, it really kind of shatters the image of, essentially a, Caucasian person with a physical disability, because that's not the totality of the disability community. And so that's something that kind of came out of Audre Lorde's writings. Again, you had the Bay Area activists at the time, Leroy Moore, Patty Bryant, and many others, who kind of also expanded the image to pretty much showcase what the disability community actually looks like. And that includes all different races and cultures and sexuality and genders. And so I think, a big issue is that we live in a society where people make really split-second determinations just based upon a very limited interaction. And like you said, Crystal, that is going to include, people's gait, people's speech, whether or not they're using any, devices. You see that a lot with individuals who have cerebral palsy. One of my friends has cerebral palsy, and it always cracks me up when we're out and somebody is like, "Hi, how are you?" And she it's an astronomically high number, like 98, 99% of people with cerebral palsy don't have any kind of cognitive impairment. But because of the way, that the speech can be affected by cerebral palsy and the gait, people make this assumption that, obviously there must be some really significant cognitive impairment. And that's not the case. But if you're already interacting with someone with that mentality, how fair and how respectful and what is that interaction really going to look like if you're going into it with that kind of mentality? I have an excellent example. I got called about a case, and they said, look, we have this kid, and we do courtesy interviews for children. Our focus is adults, but we have I particularly have a lot of experience interviewing kids with disabilities. And they said, look, we have this kid with some really complex disabilities. We're trying to interview her, and she's, unable to be interviewed. Would you be willing to do it? And we're like, yes. And so we're getting some background information, and they're like, she has Down syndrome. And I said, okay. I said, well, what's the communication disability? And they said, she has Down syndrome. I said, oh, okay. Well, Down syndrome does not necessarily imply that there needs to be any kind of communication disability.
Right.
And so, I had an idea of what I was walking into based upon that comment. So we went, and what ended up happening is, met the kid, and the kid had no problem talking. She was just like, look, the interviewer was like, hi, my name is, and the kid was like, she was talking to me like I was stupid. So I'm not going to talk to her. I don't want to talk to her. And I said, I wouldn't have probably talked either, but, there isn't even that consideration as far as, this child's not talking to you because they don't like you. It's, no, this child has a disability. And if, that's the only reason why this child could possibly not be talking to me. And those are certain, things that, just even things that I think are pretty basic. Those are things that we're constantly having to overcome. A big piece of it is going to be the community itself, and pushing to be in those courtrooms and to make those statements. And a lot of times, considering what the crime is, it could be something that, it's recorded or done on closed circuit TV. But I think it is very, very important to push for these cases to go forward, to have people take the stand, and get the courtroom in general, the system itself, to understand, look, it may take a little bit longer for this person to answer your questions. So you need to be patient. That's an accommodation. You can pause, allow them time to answer, do the closed circuit TV. There's all these accommodations that can potentially be put into place. But what usually ends up being the most effective is the more people are exposed to people with disabilities, it blows their stereotypes apart. So you can do all the education and stuff in the world, but the issue really comes down to making that connection, seeing us as, people with feelings, with knowledge, with skill sets to offer. And that's a big thing of what we're doing. So in our field, forensic interviewing, forensic nurse examinations, those are usually conducted by primarily white professionals. And, because we're doing it in a different way for the adult population, representation is really important to us. And the disability community is really a reflection of everybody at this point. And that needs to be reflected in those positions. Those have not been a position positions that people have primarily received outreach for, whether within the disability community or even within different cultural communities. Because the issue is forensic interviewing is something that really can be community-based. And who better to do those interviews than people that are part of the community? Because you already have that general knowledge of the community. You already have, hopefully, some level of trust, and you understand the dynamics. Especially, you know, in communities that are going to be more akin to religious communities. You need to understand what those dynamics are and who to talk to, like tribal lands. You know, having forensic interviewers on tribal lands, that's an entirely different justice system. You know, that's very, very different. And it's one of those things where, yes, the ADA is not necessarily doesn't necessarily have to be enforced on tribal lands, but if you have a federal agency involved, you know, when do ADA requirements kick in? So those are some areas that really there needs to be more advocacy and knowledge surrounding. But we actively, you know, are trying to get more people trained as forensic interviewers, as forensic nurse examiners, but also really being purposeful and reaching out to communities that have never really been reached out to about this type of work and saying, you know, here's the requirements for the forensic interview. You have to have a background in investigations. And then you have to take this additional training for forensic nursing. You have to be a registered nurse, and then you take this additional training and practicum and have to do some hours. But these are all things that really indicate a very specialized area. These are really things that, you know, can really assist with employment and really can be marketable. And so, you know, specifically within the disability community, this is a whole new field that people have never really even thought about, you know, potentially working in. So we are the only organization in the country that currently has a forensic interviewer whose first language is ASL, American Sign Language. It's 2023. And, you know, that's ridiculous. I mean, so I mean, the cool thing about it essentially is you can have two people who, you know, speak ASL, just have an interview together. So you don't have to clutter the room with interpreters, and closed captioning would be available for anyone who doesn't speak ASL. But it's also like, you know, it's not like in 2023 that unicorn person who you know, the unicorn deaf person is now able to do forensic interviewing. There have been so many people that could have been doing that role, that could have been in that profession. It's just not something anybody ever saw someone deaf doing. How could that possibly work? And it's like, how could that not work? It's so much more trauma responsive because you don't have all the interpreters in there, and the interpreters are not always, it's a hit and miss. You know, sometimes you get amazing interpreters, and other times it's like, you know, I had an interpreter once, and I was talking to somebody, and she was talking for like 15 minutes. And the interpreter answer was like a sentence. And I said, I know that is not what she said. Like, she's been talking this whole time. It's more than a sentence. So it's also more accurate. So, you know, in Ohio, we have only one certified deaf interpreter. And that person is also trained as a forensic interviewer. We're working now with some people who utilize communication devices to get them trained as forensic interviewers, because if you have that background, if you meet the skill sets, yes, they're prerequisites, but this is definitely a field that we should have the disability community actively participate in, not just be included, but like actually take on roles that are not victim and the people receiving the help. It's also the people that are leading the programs, that are developing the programs, that are doing the interviews, that are providing the trauma counseling. That's very, very important to see yourself reflected in all of these areas, not just in a stereotypical victim or survivor role. And the one thing that irritates me the most about all of this discussion surrounding people with disabilities being victimized at a rate 4 times more is this word vulnerability. I hate it. So, that comes out whenever you talk about abuse and the disability population. It's like disabled people are so vulnerable. And it's not true. Like, it's not like we're born and, the doctor stamps vulnerable on our forehead when we come out. We are born into a society that, does not create space for us, whose systems were not designed for us to be included on. For the most part, the idea was we would just spend the rest of our lives in institutions and no one would even have to see us. And even the services that are developed for us now and the systems that are developed for us now, they're not necessarily developed and being implemented by people with disabilities. And at their inception, they were not designed by people with disabilities. And so people kind of wonder why. Hey, like, for example, why don't we have cross disability funding? Because if you're part of the disability community, you recognize we don't live our lives in silos. We spill out into very rarely are you going to find people who have one disability. We're not able to be contained in a box, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, we sometimes are the only ones that appreciate that. And other people look at that more as a negative, but our entire lives, we're constantly adapting and evolving and creating ways to even be able to interact with the world. And people don't see that, and they don't really understand that, a lot of times, the space that we occupy wasn't given to us. We took it because, we wouldn't have gotten it any other way. And so it's one of those things to kind of keep in mind when we're working, both within the community and within our own activism. It's one of those things where it's really important to realize, the systems a lot of times are set up to separate us. And from one point of view, that makes a lot of sense, because if we're all divided up, we're not as powerful. But when we come together, and very rarely anymore do we really come together, because there's so many things that divide us, but there are still those really foundational things that we can agree on. And we are unstoppable. And those are the times, I think a lot of times we forget about our own power. About, the fact that, for the Capitol crawl and all of those things, a lot of times people don't necessarily remember that, it wasn't because one or two people were there. It was because the community showed up. That event was powerful in disability history because we all were there. Not because, our figureheads or people showed up. It was that we were there, and there is a strength in our numbers. And a lot of times I think we really just kind of don't claim our own power because we forget we have it.
Yeah. So a minute ago, you brought up the financial disparities, and when we talk about over the different races and the fact that we're held down as a whole disability community. But then if you add that also, that's a whole new burden.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
So I think, I think we still, I think people kind of forget, that if you kind of look at it from other lenses. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he came up with this concept of the talented 10. And so it was like the top professionals would be instrumental for, as African Americans were moving forward as far as education and progress and really the elite. And a lot of times I think, we sometimes buy into that. Even within our own community. A lot of times the people that we have as leaders may not necessarily be the best or the only reflection of who we are. A lot of times they're all going to have degrees. They're all going to come from, Ivy League schools. And that's great. Unfortunately, that's not everyone's history. and not everyone's experience. And, it's very, very interesting to me, that we still have so many people in facilities, and some of them there long term, where's the leadership from that community? Why are we not elevating that leadership? Why are we not doing more collaborative work between community and facility? And so we kind of do it to ourselves. We separate ourselves. We, and a lot of the issues within society are reflected within our own community. I mean, historically, there has been a very long racial history within the disability community, as far as even our leaders, treatment. A lot of times people are like, well, there isn't really disability privilege. Well, there is, and sometimes that can be reflective when, you have situations where certain medical experimentations were only done on certain groups of people. For a long time, certain groups of people all, were being diagnosed in the 80s. I think it was African-American males with schizophrenia. And so, that was a big label that was being put on people, and it wasn't necessarily accurate. And so it's one of those things where, sometimes we don't pay as much attention to that, or it doesn't get as much focus, but that's there. And so it's one of those things where, until we start being honest with ourselves, with our own history, and kind of speaking our own truth to power, we're kind of just plateauing. And it's one of those things where my truth doesn't have to necessarily be your truth, but we both deserve to speak our own truth. And there needs to be space for that, and it needs to be safe for everybody.
I see a major correlation between the things that people are trying to erase, the statues they're trying to take down, the history books they're trying to change or not even have anymore. Not just history books, but just books we like to read, and that are taught to us in school to read, things like that. Well, what about, in some ways, through this kind of talk and what you're having to do, it's been holding back disabled people, not letting them speak, trying to erase them.
Yeah, and there is a huge issue with erasure. The other piece is that there also is a lot of shame associated with the disability community that still exists. And there also is a lot of fear as far as, if you're labeled disabled, what is that going to mean? Are you going to be treated differently? Are you going to be ostracized? What's going to happen? And so I think the shame and the fear are two different pieces. The shame, a lot of times, people are afraid that if you focus on the disability, you may not see the totality of the person. And so a lot of times there are people who have, disabilities, but they're never claimed. It's not ever something that they're out and proud with. It's one of those things that is more of like a footnote. And a lot of times that's even with historical, figures. I mean, there's an amazing author, Octavia Butler, who, she had multiple disabilities, and that's not something, her work is very, very powerful, but that's our community. Because I said Octavia, there's also Octavia Spencer, who, she has dyslexia. There's, who's the woman? Is it Christina Applegate, who just came out as having multiple sclerosis? So, I mean, there, and even outside of that, the other piece with the shame is that statistically, there was a NBC report that came out that 50% of all law enforcement shootings that end in death involve someone with a disability. And, a lot of these shootings where someone is being killed or murdered, there's going to be a lot of times a mental health diagnosis attached to that. Or, in cases, autism. And a lot of times that's not necessarily released to the media. And so, that's something people may not know anything about. But there still is a lot of shame that is perpetuated by different communities, by different faith communities, by, just even like Mark said, even society in general, even what we see in the media. It's very tokenized. It's very, the definition and the depiction of people with disabilities is what people have, or the people that make the decisions have determined this is what disability is going to look like. And in reality, I mean, disability literally is picking up a mirror and walking around to everyone around you. Because anymore, thanks to COVID and everything, I mean, people forget anxiety, depression, social anxiety, these are all things that a lot of times when people throw out words like anxiety, it's like, oh, I have anxiety. Anxiety is a spectrum. There are people who have anxiety that literally, are in periods or long-term where they just really can't function. It is just so obsessive within their own, mind, and the amount of time it takes to kind of try to regulate that is just all consuming. And then there are other people who can have like situational depression that's as a result of a death or something like that. A lot of times you hear of things like autism when they're talking about a spectrum, but really spectrum exists for every single diagnosis within the disability community. And then the fear, it's one of those things where I've worked in the field for a really, really long time. I never really shared my disability because it really wasn't necessarily relevant. And then, it became important when I took on this role to, have that piece of my identity be something that people are aware of. And so I have, autism and anxiety. If you ask my friends, they say I probably have 10 other things, but those are the ones that are official. But, it was something where I did a blog post kind of talking about why we started the agency and that, it's disability led and what that means. And, from the time that that's happened, it's really validated to me why people are fearful. Because I've been, in calls and stuff where people are like, the meeting should have started about 4 or 5 minutes ago. And I've said, are we waiting for someone? And they're like, yeah, your support person. And I said, oh, okay, well, I don't have a support person. Why do you think I need a support person? And of course, as soon as I get off the phone, I call my friend and I'm like, could I have had a support person all of this time? Because how much fun could that potentially be? Because I don't need, that's not something I need. And other people do. And it's something where some people may need a caregiver, a support person for a period of time. Other people, it's, throughout their life. But, it's one of those things where you don't just make assumptions that somebody is going to have a support person because that they have a disability. And I've been on calls with people who are professionals in this field who have asked me, they're like, you don't seem like a regular autistic. Are you more like Rain Man? And I've been like, I'm pretty sure we're not supposed to say Rain Man anymore. I don't think we ever were. And, I just, I those kind of statements, you're just shocked that people are still saying that. And I'm pretty established in my own field and my own career. And those are people I'm talking to. And it's like, I can't imagine, people who are just starting off getting their nursing degree or just starting off teaching, that whole mammoth question on whether or not I disclose that I have a disability or not, the discrimination's real. It's a lot of times very overt and stuff, but a lot of times people are very, very critical of people with disabilities that are not out and proud. And I think that that's something we need to take a step back on and realize, look, there's also a safety factor. There's also a job preservation factor. And should those things really be a consideration? No, in an ideal world, but we've never lived in an ideal world. So these are all things that people have to kind of take into account. But it's like, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit that has created a brand new way of interviewing adults with disabilities. We have created protocols that have never existed before. We've trained people internationally. And I'm being asked where my support person is without any kind of, request for an accommodation and asking what kind of autistic I am. And it's, it's one of those things where it really those kind of experiences should really give us pause and, really, again, offer some grace to other people. We're very, very quick to say, even within the community, what everyone else should be doing. And the issue is that until you walk in that person's shoes, or, you take a stroll in their chair, that you're not going to really understand. And we don't have to understand why everyone does what they do. But we do need to respect that everybody's on their own journey and it's their journey to take.
And not just that. Sorry, go ahead.
Does adult advocacy centers employ non-disabled people to sort of expose them more to disabled people and sort of help eliminate some of those biases?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. We are equal opportunity. We try very hard not to discriminate against the non-disabled people. It's hard sometimes, but we try not to. And what's interesting is this has been my experience. I have yet to meet someone who doesn't have a disability. I think that's the other piece in this, is just because you're not diagnosed, I think we have really done a very big disservice to ourselves. There's this whole concept of normal. And I think I spoke about this with you and Crystal before, that there's this idea of normal. And I've been in talks and in summits and stuff where, when someone is like, well, a normal person would. And I always, raise my hand and they, are like, oh, Catherine. And I'm like, so what is normal? Just, it doesn't have to be a long definition. Just give me that one person. Who is this normal person? Anyone. It's not Oprah, because she has spoken about her own struggles and everything. It is not Mother Teresa. I mean, people, if you look at people's histories and things, most people would qualify for some level of disability, whether throughout their entire life or a piece of it. And we have all bought into this really big lie around this whole concept of what's normal, because there is no normal. And the fact that nobody can put up that one person to say, okay, when we're talking about normal, this is who we're talking about. Nobody knows who that person is. So the whole thing just really, it kind of is like, how, when you were kids, people were like, hey, do you want to buy these magic beans? I would buy the beans because I felt confident statistically at some point, I'm going to get one of the beans that's going to be magical. Well, we're doing the same thing with this whole normal thing. There is no normal. And so I think that's really kind of what the conversation needs to be more about, is that we are kind of comparing ourselves to this, illusion that has never really existed. No. Where if people were just honest with who they are and what they're going through, we all are literally in the same boat, heading in the same direction. But it's just so important for people to be able to really kind of categorize themselves in a way that makes them feel superior to somebody else. And I don't know, historically, it seems to be a trait that's very associated with communities that are very individually centered, not necessarily community centered. But it's really one of those things where, we have bought into this idea. We ascribe to it, all of us. But when you really sit down and think about it, it doesn't make any sense, at all. But it's something that continues to occur. It's kind of like in school, you had like the kids that were deemed popular. Well, why are they popular? It's because everybody else thought they were popular. But that's how this stuff occurs. It doesn't make any sense, but it only exists because we allow it to.
Yeah. We talk a lot about psychology, and it seems that there's a big problem with shame. Like, I mean, people who are insecure or feel out of control in their own personal circumstances look to control other people.
Mm-hmm.
And seek power and things like that.
Yeah,
sure?
And power.
Sorry.
Power and control. No, you're fine. I thought you were getting ready to speak. Power and control really is foundational to abuse and mistreatment. It is really the very beginning seed of what what usually ends up culminating in crimes and in torture. And you see that obviously in cases of human trafficking, but sexual assault and all of that, it's literally dominance. And the root of that, we pay a lot of attention to the crime, but what is this kind of motivating factor, this kind of incessant need to dominate and control, and what is the end result of it? Because it's not just the outside community. I mean, people within the disability community also have there's domestic violence, there's sexual assault within our own community, not just from outside the community. So I think that's something that we haven't really explored a lot. I think there's also what we also haven't explored a lot is that we've kind of been groomed for more of a control and power type of mentality. The way that people deal with disabilities, the way that we're constantly having decisions made for us, the way that we're always spoken for. I see Crystal nodding her head, but it's really, there's a foundational aspect of power and control that people with disabilities experience that are not necessarily always tied to abuse and neglect, which is sometimes different than other populations. But it's something that I think that's also could be a barrier as to why sometimes things go unreported, is because people really assimilate to that power and control mentality. And so somewhere along the lines, they kind of forget that their voice is very, very powerful. And so they just stop speaking because no one listens.
Right. It's always so interesting to me that I don't care who you are, if you have ever, well, from the moment of birth, because we're all going straight to the needle and getting shots and all this stuff. So whether you believe in vaccinations or not, you've already been. We all have, if we take medications too, like that might solve the problem of what we're currently dealing with, but it also gives us like 20 other symptoms and doing other things in our body, right? So essentially, we all have a disability. It's just in some people, it's very obvious. And it's right there in front of your face. But unless you can see it, then it's kind of like your faith. Unless you can see that, we don't believe it exists.
Yeah.
But some people. But, if you look back at the history, though, of disability, if you can put those things together, those puzzle pieces together, it becomes really, really sad. And I just wish people could open their eyes and be able to see the things going on.
Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful quote in an Audre Lorde poem. Her poem is called A Litany for Survival. And the end of the poem, it says, "It's better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive." And so even though our history has some really horrific chapters and some really long-standing abuse that just is in its fabric, we are a very, very powerful community to have experienced the generational and historical trauma, and for, you know, us to still be out there fighting and staking our claim and having our families and our jobs and, you know, being active parts of society and just living our lives. Like that within itself is an act of resistance. But you brought up a really good point, Crystal, that's really common with a lot of the work that we do, and that is, you know, trauma. Historically, the way that people deal with trauma in the disability community is with medication or with a new diagnosis. And that, you know, when trauma, of course, everyone knows has, you know, can have physical manifestations. And if you don't have a disability, there's a very good likelihood it's going to be seen for what it is. If you do have a disability, there's a very good likelihood it's going to be seen as behavioral or something that needs to be controlled. And so, you know, a lot of times in our community, there isn't access to things like trauma counseling. And that, you know, it really is medication that ends up taking that place, which really does absolutely nothing, because the root cause of it is really based upon that trauma. So that medication is just essentially masking it. But, you know, you also see that, you know, in cases of domestic violence, you know, one of the things that's a requirement for our model is when we're in the process of raising funds to build our first center. And once we have that, we're going to have a medical model part of the work that we do. So when people come in for that forensic interview, which is all voluntary, but they also would have an option to meet with a forensic nurse examiner, because we really want people to also have that medical piece done to be able to make sure when they leave that they know that, you know, their needs have been identified. And the reason for that is, like I said, domestic violence is the best example I can come up with. A lot of times the disabled population may be in situations where, you know, they are experiencing blows to the head. And, you know, when they indicate that to someone, you know, when the domestic violence is being investigated or something, you know, or they complain about a headache or something, they get medication. And people are not thinking about TBIs, you know, traumatic brain injuries. And those are things that obviously, you know, need to be identified, because if you get hit again, you'll have a compounded TBI. And, you know, traumatic brain injuries can also, you know, a lot of times people just associate them with concussions, but people die from them. People lose their speech and their vision and their ability to be mobile. And so those are all very, very important things. The other thing that our community has had to adapt to is because of the kind of unchecked abuse that a lot of times occurs. And not to say, you know, I know here in Ohio that, you know, a lot of the investigative agencies that we work with are very well trained and very, very dedicated to the work that they do. It's just the scope and the scope of the issue is just so big. It's hard sometimes to get a true handle on it. But a lot of times you have people specifically in facilities who, if you say, hey, you know, does something hurt? They'll say no. And come find out, you know, they'll have a fracture or something that's a year old, but it doesn't currently hurt because they've adapted to the pain, you know. And so some of it is even just knowing what questions to ask and what questions not to. I was consulted on a case that was a sexual assault, and it was outside the statute of limitation. And I advocated for that person to meet with a forensic nurse because the survivor was receptive towards that. And my focus was, you know, have you seen any medical professionals since that time outside of, potentially trauma counseling and additional supports and other things that could be useful. Have you had a medical examination? And she had not. And, people had asked her, does anything hurt? Is anything bothering you? No. Well, come to find out, she had syphilis for years, but because it was not something that felt new, when people were asking that question, she was answering it honestly, because back when it first happened, when she started having symptoms, yes, that was a big concern. That was a big bother. But now it's like years later, and she's adjusted to that pain, not necessarily positive or negatively. It's just adjustment. Your body adjusts. And so those are things that a lot of times fall in between the cracks because people don't understand the right way to ask the questions because they don't understand our culture and our history and, why you may not get the answer that you're looking for if you ask the question this way, but you may get it if you ask it another way.
It also says something when a crime initially happens or someone is victimized, when they feel more traumatized by the act of reporting that they've been traumatized than the actual event, there's a problem.
Yeah. Right. And that's something that we have heard a lot from within the disabled community is that, I've had people that have said, look, I don't even report it anymore because, the interrogation by law enforcement and, the constant questioning on whether or not I'm disabled enough to provide consent. They're like, that ended up being equally traumatic. And, it's like, I shouldn't have to prove to you that like I'm disabled enough that, you can believe I was raped. It's kind of like, just that general kind of just concern and compassion isn't really there. And a lot of times, and I've heard that a lot, we actually have a resource on our page that focuses on informed consent, because that's an area where people get really, really murky as far as what does that mean? And particularly within forensic nurse examinations, like what role does the guardian have if the person that, they are over does not want to have a forensic nurse examination done. And so we got experts in both of those fields to kind of sit down and kind of come up with this. I like to think it's like a desk reference now. It was supposed to be like a few pages that ended up being much, much longer, but it is the most comprehensive thing I've ever found on it. And for people who have been involved in informed consent cases, myself being one of them, those are always a mess. And they always end up really being very, very traumatic for everybody involved. And essentially, what it comes down to is that the medical establishment has to work under ethics and first do no harm. And so, there's all different positions people can take on that when guardians are involved, but the nurse themselves should not be doing those exams if the person who needs the exam does not want it. I mean, people with disabilities have the right, with or without a guardian, to be able to provide consent. I think there's also a really big misconception with what, just because someone has a guardian doesn't mean that they don't have the right to make any decisions. And I think that that's an area where there hasn't really been enough education surrounding that. But we've had some horrible cases, not necessarily, there was one we were not involved in, but it involved a survivor of sexual assault who was deafblind. And the forensic nurse and the detective couldn't figure out how to explain to her about having the physical examination done. And she didn't fingerspell or read Braille. And for a lot of people, they have their little box of accommodations. And once you've gone through their box, they don't know what to do. And so, it was one of those situations where they really didn't know any other accommodation to offer, and they didn't know who to reach out to. So essentially she was held down and the exam was done, which you never do, because that's essentially another rape or a sexual assault. And so in those kind of situations, it's one of those things where you keep on trying until you figure out a way to provide this person with information so that they can make an informed decision. And that informed decision is not always yes. You want to give them enough information so that they can decide what's best for them, not so that you can set it up so that they do what you want them to do. And so something that could have been done is like a tactile social story. There's a lot of different things that are sometimes outside the box. But, if nothing else, a lot of times people reach out to us just for resources and for information. And, I am a true believer that, I don't have all the answers, but darn it, I'm going to find out who does. And I'll refer people that way because, I have my history of investigations is that, I remember the faces of the people I had to send back because there wasn't evidence. And you knew someone was being sexually assaulted or human trafficked. But if you don't have that evidence, sometimes it's really, really hard to prove it. And you have to have that. And so, it's one of those things where I've kind of seen both sides of it. It's very, very different, to take classes or to, develop papers and toolkits. And those are great. And we need those. And there are some amazing ones out there. But there's also a place for people who have had their boots on the ground, who have done this work, who have, held the hands of people while they're crying. Like I'm the person people talk to on the worst day of their entire lives. And they share things that they may never tell another person. And that's their story. That's not my story. A lot of times we are asked, do you have people that you've worked with that could tell us a personal story of something that they've done? And I know that that's something a lot of organizations do. I know that, there's a ton of conferences I go to, and there's like a self-advocacy piece where somebody, bears their soul about this traumatic rape. And it just feels very disconnected because a lot of times it's around lunch and people are eating. And it's just like, this is not entertainment. This is literally like trauma pornography or trauma competition. And it's kind of like, that's something that we have really purposely not done. And I know that, we've been told that that's detrimental, but it feels very exploitive. And there are people who, are survivors that are fierce advocates that want to tell their story. And there's a place for that. People need to hear those first person accounts. But that also needs to come from that person. And when that person's ready and whatever mode or delivery to tell that story. But it kind of feels like, trauma tokenization. And it's one of those things that I'm very sensitive with because, people with disabilities, for the most part, a lot of times are tokenized. Or, it's kind of like, oh, you think that's bad. Well, at least you don't have a disability, and it's like, then throwing us up on the stage to talk about a rape. It's like, come on, like it's not entertainment. And like I said, for people who have those experiences, who want to tell their story, they need that space to do it. But it needs to be something that is their choice to do. In their own platform. And like I said, it just should not be done during lunch. And that's how it always ends up going. And every time I see that on like the description, it's like, why doesn't this bother other people? Like, it's literally, and I think that's the other piece is that, once you have, failed at some of these cases. And I have failed at most of these cases because the justice system has not been set up for people with disabilities. And so, you get a different perspective. I had a case where someone had significant mental health and autism, and he was being restrained on a bed. And there was a video camera in the room. and captured it. And the staff person was on top of him in the bed, and the staff person ended up falling asleep on top of him, and a blanket got wrapped around his neck, and you're literally watching the man dying. And to me, that's open and shut. Like, this case is good to go. You know, from an investigative standpoint, I mean, you can't get better evidence than actually watching the crime occur. I mean, it's horrific. But from an investigation standpoint, it's like, okay, the prosecutor wouldn't prosecute because he said that the staff person was not mentally culpable because the person was so behavioral, that it couldn't be his fault. And, you know, that's something that my background is more activism. So that's something that a lot of times when I'm told no, I figure out, well, okay, what are the appeal rights? What are, you know, what other agencies can I pull in? How far up can I take this? And I took that as far as I could go. And there were no charges. And that's a case where you have this video evidence of someone being murdered. And, you know, no, the person's too behavioral. And so, I mean, so those are kind of, you know, some examples of, you know, even when you have, from an investigative point of view, even when you have all the pieces for the puzzle, you know, that disability piece, depending on who you're working with, that historical stereotyping, that ingrained discrimination, that is sometimes even more powerful than the truth.
Right. When you systemically are not given the opportunity initially to, people are biased about your disability. So when you do try to report stuff, they do try to take a statement from you, they already have pre-notions about the way you look, the way you talk, the way you do this, that. They're different. They're uncomfortable. So, you know, you don't have, you know, it's not fair from the very beginning. So then that statement is not fairly read over when it comes to the bigger processes.
Mm-hmm. And that actually reminds me, I read an article about Judith Heumann, going back to your example earlier, and how, you know, a big fight for her early on was just even being able to get access to the school system. And that, you know, a lot of these fights that we've done really parallel, you know, different areas of society. And so we've had these fights before. And with criminal justice, you know, it's one of those things where we have to keep on showing up. We have to keep on reporting. We have to keep on demanding ADA accommodations, because there are a lot of people that are not going to be able to do that. So those of us that can, we need to do that. The other piece is we need to hold people accountable. We need to file formal ADA complaints when our rights are being when our rights are not being respected and met. We need to be requesting things to be made accessible, and then filing lawsuits when they're not. I mean, that's, you know, like, again, you know, I am definitely under the mindset where, you know, I would love people to do the right thing. But unfortunately, again, in our community, everything that we've gotten for the most part, as far as, you know, laws and different standings is things that we've achieved through the legal system. And so, you know, with that reporting piece, you know, there are so many problems. That's something that we're kind of looking at too, because, you know, for you, Crystal, you can go to the police station and have a conversation. But for someone who literally relies on a staff person or a caregiver for everything, you know, even for communication, and that caregiver is the one that's abusing them, how do you get that person? How do you give that person the ability to even be able to report? And then there's the whole concept of currently people who use communication devices. There are not consistent images or texts across all these devices that are consistent, which is important for when things go to court. And so there are some devices that you can't even report abuse or any kind of crime on, because you don't necessarily have the language support, whether that's through images or text or whatever. And that's a whole segment of society doesn't even have the ability to report. I know that, we've been looking for some funding to create some consistent images and texts. There's been some really significant work that's come out of South Africa and Australia around abuse and neglect and crimes and images and texts and alternative and augmented technology. And we've been working with Communication First, which is, if you're not familiar with them, they're the national organization that does legal advocacy for people with communication disabilities. They're amazing. But we've been working with them and University of Illinois in Chicago and Temple University to really come up with an app that could be free, that would live on the cloud, that everyone who has these devices would be able to access these images and these texts. So that would aid them in forensic interviews, that would aid them in forensic nurse examinations. And that would also aid them outside of being able to report to become much more empowered when discussing their body and discussing sex and discussing crime. A lot of times people, what ends up being really interesting to me is people are like, oh, we have this case, this person has no concept of what sex is, because they're so cognitively delayed. Well, they probably have no concept of what sex is because no one's ever explained it. Because, there's still a big segment of society that feel like people with disabilities should not, be given that information about sex education because, they're just going to go outside and have sex with everybody, which of course would not, at all happen. But, there's also, back to what you were saying, Crystal, about power control, huge amount of power control about the information that we're even given. And that's, for those of us that are out in the community, for people who are in facilities, and a lot of times the people in facilities, you're going to see more communication challenges. And it's one of those things where we are making these judgments on what people can understand and what they can't. And we're not even taking into account, nobody's even introduced the concept like safety. If no one explains to you what safety is, what does that mean? How do you have any concept about it? So when people start asking you questions about safety, you're not going to be able to answer them because you don't understand what it is. That doesn't mean you're not capable of understanding what it is. It just means that nobody actually thought it was important enough to sit down and discuss what is safety. What does that look like to you? What is unsafe? Same thing with sexuality or sex education. So that's a big part, is that, there is a lot of power and control over information, and who receives that information and who doesn't, and who is the one that's able to decide what information's given. And that can be very dangerous.
Yes. This has been a really good interview. We have another one coming up, but we have to eat lunch first.
Right.
So, Mark, did you have anything you want to?
No, I didn't. I was watching the time too. I forgot about lunch, so I didn't account for lunch.
Oh, well, somebody has to.
Well, that's going to be too bad. Hopefully you'll have time for lunch. No,
we definitely want to talk with you again and get some more, you have some really good insights and things that you're doing. I'm so thankful of what you're doing.
Oh yeah. Whenever you guys want to touch base or do another interview, just reach out, because like I said, I enjoy talking to both of you. So this has been actually fun. So usually this is not fun. So, that has been really good. So whenever, feel free to reach out, and I'd love to come back and discuss.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you guys for having this platform so people, can, kind of explain their own journeys. That's really a wonderful gift that you're giving to people. So thank you for that. And I don't know what the medical things that are going on, Mark, but I hope it's getting taken care of up there in Canada. And I hope you're back with Crystal soon. So take care of yourself.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Catherine.
All right.
Thanks, Catherine.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.